This week on the Grand Old Gospel Podcast, Andy Daughtry and myself, Wendell Carr, talk about the differences between live recordings and studio recordings. We also have a special interview guest, Mr. Eddie Crook, pianist, arranger, producer, and member of the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. That's all coming up on the Grand Old Gospel Podcast.
You are now listening to the Grand Old Gospel Podcast, live from the beautiful city of Roses in Thomasville, Georgia. We're so glad you joined us today as two guys who love Southern gospel music have a nostalgic celebration of the individuals and groups whose musical legacy have left a lasting mark on Southern gospel music. Let's get started. Here are your hosts, Wendell Carr and Andy Daughtry.
All right, thank you very much. It's another great week here at the Grand Old Gospel Podcast. I'm Wendell Carr, and my co-host, Reverend Andy Daughtry. Andy, say hello.
Hello, Wendell Carr. It's good to be with you on this, can you believe, episode 5 of the Grand Old Gospel Podcast.
Yeah, you know, Andy, we've talked several times about this, so why don't we get into a discussion? Which is your favorite? Is it the studio-produced albums or the live in concert albums that the groups
yes,
produce?
The age-old debate, studio album, live album. For me, nothing comes down to the genuine joy and energy of a really well-done live album. I'm a live album guy. I bought them a lot. As I've shared with our friends, the first one I ever bought was a live album. It was a double album. It had the best of both. But I love the live album experience. Probably the greatest thing about that is you get the energy of a group interacting with the audience, with the crowd, the congregation, wherever they are that's recorded. You get that energy. And that's one of the things I like about that live album. It is though you are in the room with them at that moment, and the energy is really good.
It's like being the next best thing to being at the concert.
Right.
And you feel like you're taking home that concert experience with you.
That's right. And I think a couple of groups come to mind that did that really well. One of the first live albums that I heard from way back was a Blackwoods at Long Beach, California. And that was the infamous Baby Crying album where J.D. Sumner was singing He Means All the World to Me, and he goes down for a low note. And on the way down, the mics that were placed in the audience, you could very distinctly hear on the album. This is an LP, 33 1/3 vinyl LP. You could hear a baby start crying and never wanted to miss an opportunity. In mid-note, J.D. pauses and says, "Bless its heart." And it just broke the place up. And it was probably one of the greatest spontaneous moments ever caught on an album. And when they finished the song, apparently Big Chief came out and shook his hand for, congratulating him on hitting the low note. And JD said, no, that wasn't it. He said, when I said, "Bless its heart," I thought it was a baby crying. It was Big Chief. And that just stopped the place for a while. So those kind of things happen on a live album. And that is a wonderful thing for the gospel fan. And to have that preserved in a live album. Where do you stand, live or studio?
I, of course, just like you, my first album was a live album. We've talked about it before. The Happy Goodman family wanted live. And again, there's something about that energy. There's something about that feeling like you are there in a concert with the group, and you feel their pacing, you feel the ups, the downs, and how they would move the congregation or the crowd through a program,
Yes.
It's all about pacing. I learned that years ago as a radio disc jockey. You can't have all fast songs. You can't have all slow songs. There's a pacing that has to take place, with a good presentation or a good program. And so the live albums, however, I have to admit that I think nowadays we have the best of both worlds, because if you really think about it, back in the old days, a lot of those recordings were only done on 2 tracks.
Yeah, that's right.
There was no going back and redoing. It was simply a 2-track reel-to-reel recorder, and what you saw is what you got type
That's
thing.
Right. I can't imagine recording under those circumstances.
That's a lot of pressure, you know.
A lot of pressure.
But, you know, nowadays, of course, we've got multi-tracks. You've got these big studio trucks that will come in and do the recordings. But even at that, a lot of times what happens is they will take those recordings, the live recording, and then take it back into the studio and tweak it, if you will, fix missed notes or sweeten it up, add more instrumentation. But you still get that feeling of the reactions from the crowds, and when they're into what's going on the stage, they've just made the vocals and the music itself better.
I agree. It gives that, and we do have the best of both worlds. You know, you mentioned one thing I was thinking as you were speaking. There are some groups that are just made for the live experience. I think the Statesmen were that way. Blackwoods outsold them 2-1 at the record table, but nobody could touch them on the stage. The Goodmans, one of your favorite groups, and mine too. To see them live was an experience unlike anything else.
You and I have talked about this several times, about that Vestal moment.
The Vestal moment, yes.
The Vestal moment. And anybody who's a gospel music fan will kind of know what we're talking about here. For me, it's the moment like at Bill Gaither's homecoming concerts that he would have. Yeah. Second half, when the Goodmans would come out, traditionally they started the second half of the program.
Yes.
And when that crowd heard Vestal's voice, when they hit that second half,
I hold a clear title.
The whole
roof came off.
Roof come off the place.
Everybody was on there. Florida.
Yes, exactly.
When that happened.
It's just a moment that I don't think we see anymore. I don't know of anyone else right now that has that kind of power and that kind of status that could turn an entire convention center upside down like she did when they came on. Yeah. It's just the Vestal moment, and that's how I describe it.
Absolutely. The other thing I wanted to bring up, there are some great studio albums that I like. Now, I'm a live album kind of guy. Both of us are live album guys. We like that. But there's some great studio albums. Cathedrals with the London Symphony. That was a groundbreaking album. Tremendous. Their a cappella albums. Tremendous.
Produced by Larry Goss.
Yes.
The arrangements for them. Yes.
Just unbelievable. Musicality, tremendous, just excellence. So there are those in the genre. And while we're talking live albums and cathedrals, Live in Atlanta.
Yep.
That's one of our favorites.
Absolutely.
And you talk about flow. They could put on a clinic. George Yonts knew how to MC a program. They knew how to put one together. And,
George and Glenn knew what songs to pick.
They did. And sometimes it made us scratch our heads.
You and I have talked about that before, and I'm sure we will again.
And we will again, but it worked, and they knew what resonated with people and touched the fans.
And those songs, even if you hear someone do them today, you still think of the Cathedrals.
So many great groups like that. The studio album or the live album? The debate continues.
Gospel Music Trivia.
Today's Southern Gospel Music Trivia question: how did Hovey Lister come up with the name The Statesman? We'll return with the answer right after this.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss an episode of the Grand Old Gospel Podcast by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you, and we thank you for your support. Now, let's get back to the show.
So, how did the Statesmen get their name? Georgia Governor Herman Talmadge published a small newspaper called The Statesman, and Hovey Lister asked permission to use the name, and Talmadge granted it. And that's our Southern Gospel Trivia for this week.
The Grand Old Gospel Podcast Special Guest.
And now here's Wendell Carr with today's special guest.
Thank you, Andy. This week on the Grand Old Gospel Podcast, we have a special guest here. He's a pianist, songwriter, arranger, and producer, one of the most successful businessmen in Southern gospel music who has left his imprint on this industry. Best known for his years behind the piano with the Happy Goodman Family Band, we are so excited to have with us today Mr. Eddie Crook. Eddie, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. It is such an honor to have you here on the Grand Old Gospel Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on with you, Wendell.
I want to tell you that when Andy and I were starting to plan this podcast, Andy asked me who would be your dream guest. I mean, just reach for the stars. Who would you really like to have on? And yours was the name that came up. And that was my dream guest to have on the podcast. So I am certainly thrilled and honored to have you here.
That's very kind of you.
Well, Mr. Crook, tell us a little bit about your background with regards to the piano. Was that your major in college? Did you take lessons coming up as a child? And just a little bit about your background with the piano.
Well, when I was young, I think I was 5 years old, my mother said, "You're going to take piano lessons." And we didn't even have a piano. But I started taking piano lessons in Nashville for 4 years. And the typical piano lessons, playing classical stuff, popular stuff, having recitals, all of that. I was born in Nashville, and so kind of for the first 10 years of my life, that's where I lived. So took piano lessons there, and then my family moved away from Nashville about 70 miles east of Nashville toward Cookville, Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And it was in a rural area, and they didn't have any piano teachers. And my piano playing kind of went on a hiatus there for a while. And plus, I lived out in the country, a 2-room school where I went. And all of these kids, are farmers and whatnot. And a boy playing the piano is kind of not, cool.
Right.
So I kind of laid off there. But anyway, that's kind of my background as far as playing the piano. And when I reached the 8th grade, piano playing got kind of popular. The girls started liking it, and I got in high school. It was all go then. So I started playing for Rotary clubs, Lions clubs, meetings, and things like that.
Okay. Did you continue your studies on into college, or?
Well, I went to college for a while, and I played in the band, but I played a horn in the band, and played piano kind of off campus, so to speak, with some bands, that were mm-hmm. playing for a little while. But then I dropped out of college and went to playing piano with a singing group that was based out of Nashville called the Tennesseans Quartet. And so I started there playing with them, and I never did look back.
So when did you first develop your first interest in Southern gospel music? Because I know you said you were trained on the classics and coming up and doing popular music, but when did Southern gospel really kind of catch your attention?
Well, strange as it may seem, I had never heard of gospel music as we know it until I was a junior in high school. A senior in high school friend invited me to go to the all-night singing in Nashville at the Ryman Auditorium on a Friday night. So I went with him, and so that was my first introduction to gospel music at the Ryman Auditorium at the all-night singing, which was mostly the Statesmen, the Blackwood Brothers, the Spear Family, Chuck Wagon Gang, those groups at that time. We're talking about 1958.
Right.
And that was my first introduction to gospel music. But I reckon it took. So from that point on, that's all I studied. I mean, that's all I studied.
Right.
I practiced the piano all the time, played, listened to the radio, listened to all the radio stations that we could pick up that played gospel music in the afternoon or Sunday morning, whatever. So that's where I started.
Right. So who were some of your influences? Who were out of the pianist? Who do you think really influenced you as far as your style and helped develop you?
Well, at the time, like I said, when I was first introduced to gospel music, the Blackwood Brothers had a guy named Jackie Marshall
Mm-hmm.
who played the piano. And he was kind of the top of the line, I believe, at that time. And I kind of copied some of his runs and things. He was, I thought he was really good. And then when he left, a guy named Wally Varner took his place. And Wally Varner had some other runs, and some things that he did.
I thought Wally was nothing but runs.
Well, he was really good, though. I mean, I enjoyed it very much. And but all this time, even though I was loving the gospel music and listening to those guys play the piano, even Hovey Lister playing with the Statesmen, his way of kind of pounding it out, influenced me also. But I was also listening to Liberace records all the time also. So I was kind of gathering all the piano I could, I guess.
So I know that you're remembered most for your time with the Happy Goodman family as far as the pianist and the arranger and kind of leader of their band. Were there some other groups that you played for along the line?
That's true. When the Tennesseans quit singing, the bass singer, he left and went with the Harvesters Quartet. The lead singer, his name was Dale Shellnut. He went with the Dixie Echoes. At that time, I had 3 offers to play piano with 3 different groups. One of them was the Couriers Quartet out of Pennsylvania, and one was the Stamps Quartet out of Memphis, and one was the Plainsman Quartet in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Well, the Baton Rouge thing was attracted to me because they backed up the former governor, Jimmy Davis, who was real popular. He was the one that wrote "You Are My Sunshine," and I had all of these things. What's so funny is when I was in school listening to the radio, I heard Jimmy Davis on the radio. And here I am, an opportunity to go play with him. So that's where I went. My wife and I, my daughter, we moved to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We lived there for 3 years. And I tell people, I said, I chose that. If I'd have gone with the Stamps, though, when they offered me the job, I might have wound up playing with Elvis.
Yeah.
But
That's true.
That wasn't part of the plan. So anyway, the Tennesseans go, the Plainsmen. So the Plainsmen for 3 years, and then we used to play a lot of these country programs out in the Midwest. Grand Ole Opry people, Minnie Pearl, Ernest Tubb, all these different ones. And one weekend or tour we were on, a guy named Marty Robbins was on the program. Wow. Well, he was the program. We just happened to be with him. And at the end of the night, one of their band members come back and said, "Would you be interested in playing piano with us?" So it didn't take me too long to say yes, because
Wow.
it was an opportunity to move from Baton Rouge back to Nashville. So we moved back to Nashville. I played piano with Marty Robbins' band on the Grand Ole Opry and all that stuff. And then until it got where that wasn't what God wanted me to do. And so the next part of my life, I went with a gospel group called the Siegel Brothers and Naomi.
Yeah.
They were kind of popular back in the 60s and 70s. And so that was my opportunity to get back in gospel music. The Marty Robbins thing was my ticket back to Nashville. But I played the piano with the Siegel Brothers and Naomi, and for 3 years with them. And then I quit them and was playing recordings in Nashville, doing just sessions. And then that's when the Happy Goodman family opportunity came up.
How did that come up? I mean, were the Goodmans looking to create a band? I just, how did that opportunity? I don't think I've ever read how that actually happened for you.
Well, this is my version. In Nashville, they recorded on the Canaan label, which was out of Texas. And in the recording studio, they call players to play on the sessions, you know, the guitar, the bass, the drums, piano. I think Rusty and Sam Goodman probably saw me playing piano with the Siegel Brothers and Naomi, or we would play dates together. So anyway, they were in the studio recording, and they called me to play piano on the recording. So I did, obviously. I mean, I did. I think I played on an album and a half of recordings they did in Nashville. Okay, after that, Rusty Goodman, they put a studio in Madisonville, Kentucky, their own recording studio.
Right.
So they had to have musicians to play recordings there. So they called me to come and play piano. They called guys out of Nashville to play guitar, you know, and we all drove up to Madisonville, Kentucky, which is about 100 miles from Nashville, to play these sessions. So one thing leads to another. One day, Vestal Goodman developed some type of illness or something, and she stayed home. And Howard, I assume you all know who these people are.
Oh, yes.
Howard Goodman stayed with her. They asked me if I would fill in for Howard. And Howard and Vestal's daughter, her name is Vicky.
Mm-hmm.
And she filled in for her mom. So it was Vicky and Rusty and Sam. That was the group for a little while. I filled in, okay, for
Right.
Howard. Okay, later on, Vestal got better. Vestal and Howard are back on the stage. Vicky is no longer on the stage. But by now, I think Sam and Rusty had kind of liked having the piano a little more smooth piano playing.
Different styles, very different. Yeah.
So there was a time there where Howard would go out. The Goodmans would go on stage, and they would sing their opening song, and then I would walk out, and Howard would stand up, and I'd take over playing the piano.
The sweetest song I know. Absolutely.
We did that for a while, but then it started evolving. The next thing we know, they're adding a musician here, you know, getting another musician. And finally, it moved to where Howard didn't play at all. He just stood up and sang. So that's kind of how I wound up being with the Happy Goodman family. It started out playing on their recordings in Nashville and moving up there and playing recordings in their studio. And then it got to the place where it was just made no sense. So we moved from Nashville to Madisonville, Kentucky. My wife, we lived up there for 5 years, and we were in the studio every day. When on the weekends, we was out on the road playing everywhere from Texas to Pennsylvania. But when we were at home, we was in the recording studio all the time.
Well, that actually explains a lot of things. That explains that tightness that on the road, when you heard the Goodmans, it sounded like they had a studio band.
Well, I remember somewhere that we were in a concert and intermission or something, some guy come around and said, "You guys sound like a record." We took that as a compliment.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Mr. Eddie, Andy Daughtry here. As I spoke to you as we got started today, I played, and as a pianist, I'm sitting here and hearing this roll call, the Plainsmen, my goodness, the Tennesseans, Seago Brothers and Naomi, and you kind of, the thing I've often talked with Wendell about you is I heard you first with the Goodmans, and that's a style. That is a style. When you're playing with piano with a band, you're part of the band. That's a different style than maybe earlier on where you were the band. You had to do rhythm. You had to do everything.
That's right.
And it's a completely, how did you, and hearing, and I can tell it now, I think it was the country influence, that session, Nashville session, kind of helped you, because I've never heard anybody that could do both so brilliantly. That style I heard with the Tennesseans and some of that other style, it's amazing, that old style piano. And then to go to that, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, the Tennesseans at that era, it was, with the exception perhaps of the group called the Lefevres, it was basically a piano player and a quartet, like the Statesman, the Blue Ridge, or the Harvesters, or whoever. It was basically a piano player and the four singers. So the piano player had to play the fill-ins, he had to play the rhythm, or a combination of both. And then when I went with the Marty Robbins, it was a full band. I mean, I had to adjust, because he had drums. I didn't have to boom chink anymore.
You didn't have to oompa.
I didn't have to do that anymore. So that was that helped there in that process. And then leaving him and playing with the Seago Brothers and Naomi, they had a guy to play bass and a guy to play guitar, and their son played drums. So we had to kind of work that out, to stay together. And then James Seago, he used to record groups in Nashville in a recording studio, and I would be the piano player for that. And then would you be playing piano with Nashville players? Mm-hmm. So you're forced into playing whatever fits at the time, whatever that is, or you don't get called.
That's right. That's right. Well, I've said to Wendell, I'll say to you, and I think I'm not alone in this evaluation, there are certain artists that come along that that change and impact. And I think Eddie Crook was one of those particular with that. And we likewise think the Goodmans are one of those groups, those seminal groups that change things forever. But Eddie Crook on that piano set the new style. To me, you are you set the standard for that style. And it is an excellent style, a memorable style, and it's one of those. And I know I am not alone in that evaluation, but it just a wonderful way you were able to minister through the music that way.
Well, God blessed me with the ability to do it, and the knowledge and everything, and I just happened to be at the right place at the right time.
It was a great thing. I think, Wendell, it was you. What was your comment about hearing, knowing an Eddie Crook intro? What was it you were sure?
To this day, if I hear the song, I'm Living in Canaan Now, and they do not play your introduction, they did that song wrong in my book. That is just, they're not playing that right.
They're just not playing that right.
That is the introduction for that. And many of your introductions are as classic as the songs. I mean, the introduction just sets such a style there that it's like, no, if I hear another introduction, it's like, no, that's not right. I have to pay that compliment while I have the chance.
Oh, I appreciate it. We tried to, play and do things that fit the song, whatever that song might be. We tried to do things that, would fit and be enjoyable to the audience.
We really hope you enjoyed the podcast today. It was a great time talking with gospel legend Eddie Crook. We'll have more from Mr. Crook next week in part 2 of his interview. Please subscribe to be notified of any future episodes. For myself, Wendell Carr, and my co-host, Reverend Andy Daughtry, we'll talk to you next week on the Grand Old Gospel Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Grand Old Gospel Podcast. If you'd like to hear more, hit the subscribe button. While you're at it, follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Grand Old Gospel Podcast for updates and video clips of the groups mentioned on this week's podcast. Also, check out our website at anchor.fm/Grand Old Gospel Podcast for a list of our current and past episodes. Until next week from the Grand Old Gospel Podcast, keep on singing a gospel song.